My regards, friends. Welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. And today, on this day, the 12th of May, Monday, I bring you the traditional briefing on the events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. So, the 12th of May, and that means that today, a ceasefire was supposed to take effect. These were exactly the proposals and the conditions put forward by Ukraine and all our Western partners. By supporting the relevant appeal, which was made even earlier, because I want to remind you that the need for a 30-day ceasefire as a condition for further negotiations was agreed upon 2 months ago in Saudi Arabia. This proposal came specifically from the United States of America. Ukraine acted in an absolutely constructive and consistent manner in this situation and declared its intention to implement a 30-day ceasefire without any conditions, which is important, I remind you. Ukraine took this step. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly emphasized that we are ready. And once again, following the visit, an important visit of the leaders of the European coalition countries willing to help. On May 10th in Kyiv, it was once again agreed that the precondition and first stage of the negotiation process to end the Russian-Ukrainian war should be a ceasefire, starting from May 12th. Putin, as we can see, rejected this proposal. He did not take this step. The fire did not cease. Russian troops continue to attack Ukrainian positions. Moreover, last night, Russia launched a large number of Shahed-type kamikaze drones at Ukraine. In other words, there is no ceasefire all taking place. In fact, Putin ignored the demand of the entire civilized Ulama world addressed to him. He rejected all of this, once again demonstrating that he absolutely does not care about proposals, conditions, demands, or warnings that tougher sanctions could be imposed. This does not work. It did not work this time, and it will not work next time. Because until there is a shift from words to real, concrete actions and deeds, until we see that real actions follow the words, until we see that Russia is truly being punished, because they must be punished for the crimes committed by the Putin regime against Ukraine, he will not cease fire. Moreover, we see that Russia is trying to impose its agenda on the entire world. And unfortunately, there are trends indicating that the world is showing weakness. There is no determination, no courage, and no real action. The only ones who are currently brave, determined, and unafraid are the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian national resistance. These are the ones who are now fighting. Despite how difficult the situation is, despite all the challenges, despite the exhaustion, but they are holding the front. Our army, our defense forces of Ukraine. These are the ones who continue the struggle. These are the leadership qualities of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the President of Ukraine, who still holds this front, and despite everything, is confident, in a good way, precisely with such stubbornness and perseverance, continues this struggle. And now, the main question arises. We see that the West is showing weakness, and the moment of truth is on May 12th. Why am I saying this? Because it was the Western partners who promised us that if Putin does not back down and accept the terms of the ceasefire, if the fighting continues and nothing changes, then much tougher and more powerful sanctions against Russia will be imposed. And logically, Ukraine should have received a greater number of forces and resources, a much larger amount of weaponry, in order to deliver painful strikes against Russian military targets. Whether this will happen, we will see today, during the 12th of May. How will the West respond? But what is the problem and what is the trouble? The problem is that the West cannot firmly insist on its own agenda. Well, if you have already proposed that, starting from May 12th, a ceasefire should be established as the first precondition for in the negotiation process. Then stand your ground, insist on your position, put pressure on Putin. Don't be afraid of him. He is not as frightening and dangerous as some might think. Ukraine has demonstrated this. So many myths about some kind of Russian invincibility, and so on have been debunked during this war, starting from 2014, and especially during the full-scale Russian invasion since 2022. More than one myth has been shattered. But now the problem is that it is the West that is showing certain weaknesses, not going all the way. And this decision that we need to accept Putin's terms, that we need to hold a meeting in Istanbul on May 15th, on Thursday, even if the fighting is not stopped. This amounts to concessions to the aggressor. This is something the West might be pushing Ukraine toward. I think that President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is taking this step based on what he said. And indeed, bravely, decisively, and absolutely immediately, the head of the Ukrainian state declared clearly, okay, you want Istanbul, let it be Istanbul. May 15th, then May 15th. Zelensky said that he would be there in person. Will Putin be there? Well, you understand that he won't be there. Putin will not come. Firstly, he is afraid of such decisive steps. He is cautious. Secondly, why would he need this? Putin is not interested in speeding up the negotiation process to end the war. He is interested in creating the illusion and pretending that he is involved in the so-called peace process. He is interested in sending certain signs and signals to make it seem as if he cares about this and is truly interested in ending the war. But in reality, that's not the case. In fact, Putin has a clear vision that he wants to restore specifically the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. It should include Ukraine, Bessarabia, that is Moldova, and possibly even part of Romania, Poland, all of it, as well as all the Baltic countries. And further, wherever they cannot reach, where they cannot actually occupy, these countries should still be subordinate to and controlled by Russia. That is, the so-called countries of the former Warsaw Pact, Bulgaria, Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia. These are all Putin's intentions. And now he is trying to implement this plan in various ways, including through a large-scale aggressive war against Ukraine. He will not change. He will not change his terms. He will not change his approach. He will not change his mindset. You know, I study and research the enemy because you need to know your enemy in order to understand and be aware of his weak points, to know where he is vulnerable, to understand his beliefs and what to expect from him. And if you look, for example, at an interview with Putin from 2002, there is such an interview online where a journalist sits and recalls how he interviewed the Russian dictator back in 1991 when Putin was working at the St. Petersburg City Hall. And so he compares Putin's views. And already back in 1991, Putin was stating that, well, in fact, the Soviet Union, as well as Lenin and Stalin, made a lot of mistakes because they established the borders and boundaries of the republics that were part of the Soviet Union. He especially emphasized Ukraine, saying that supposedly this later made it possible to create an independent state in Ukraine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union within the borders that exist today. And he said that, in fact, the actions of the Soviet leaders led to the deconstruction and ultimate collapse of the empire, which negatively affected Russia's interests. This is his established viewpoint. This is the established viewpoint of the Russian dictator. It does not change, and that is why this is Putin's only demand, that Ukraine must, in one way or another, cease to exist within its current borders. Surkov, who this year, Putin's former aide, gave an interview 2 months ago to French media, stated that Ukraine should remain only in a small part, that only a tiny patch somewhere in western Ukraine should ultimately be called Ukraine. Everything else should, one way or another, come under Russian control, because Russia must expand. And this is the concept. Do you understand? This is the ideological basis on which modern Russia exists. Without changing Putin, dismantling this criminal Putin regime, and altering the ideas, meanings, and foundations on which modern Russia exists, it is simply impossible. This is what needs to be understood. So, why would anyone expect Putin to speed things up? He is interested in prolonging the war because, first, he believes he can continue to weaken Ukraine, that the West will grow tired and reduce its support for us, and that Russia will deplete our potential with its terrorist strikes on civilian cities by trying to advance along the front line, especially in the summer, taking advantage of more favorable weather conditions, and in this way achieve the goals and objectives of forcing Ukraine to capitulate. Putin is interested in Ukraine's capitulation. That is the only thing he cares about in negotiations under the current circumstances. To change this, for example, the British publication The Times clearly writes that Putin will specifically demand Ukraine's capitulation at the negotiations. This refers to demands to secure for itself the territories that Russia currently occupies. In addition, Pesineko to hold elections, Ashna changed the Ukrainian government, legally renounced joining NATO, and cede territories. Well, then there's the Russian language, the FSB-controlled church, and so on. These are the kinds of demands he might make, as shared with us by The Times. That's why it's absolutely clear that he won't back down from this position. He will drag out time, creating the illusion of a negotiation process. That's why, on Thursday, he personally will not come to Istanbul. This needs to be understood. I think all of you, my viewers, are well aware of this. Zelensky, in turn, makes a strong move and says, all right, President Trump is calling to start some negotiations. To come, I will come. Well, if Putin doesn't show up, the Ukrainian president will have the opportunity to hold high-level talks with our Turkish partners, with President Erdogan, about developing security and defense cooperation, the economy, and so on. In other words, the visit will still be put to good use. The trip there won't be for nothing. Okay, let it be that way. But Putin won't come. Putin will send some Ushakovs, Lavrovs, or other representatives instead. Of course, given his status, the president of Ukraine doesn't need to meet with them. Moreover, after this, Russia will try to blame Ukraine specifically for allegedly disrupting the negotiation process and for the lack of an adequate response to the proposals coming from Putin under the guise of so-called peacemaking. That essentially, one is what can be expected from this. And that is precisely why the war continues. That is why we need to understand that the war will not end as long as Moscow exists as a neo-imperial center. This empire must fall. It must be destroyed, just as other empires have fallen. Our war is not just for our freedom, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Our war, in essence, is revolutionary. It is meant to revive that very spirit, which existed since the times of the French Revolution and beyond. That spirit of the sense of freedom, the sense of movement, of progress, what humanists all over the world have fought for. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the foundations, the very bedrock on which France exists, and ultimately the ideals of freedom. And democracy, that have been celebrated by many American politicians, scholars, experts, and legal professionals. This is another distinctive feature of our war, but it is clear that any revolutionary nature of the situation, in the positive sense of the word, raises concerns. And this somewhat frightens, among others, our Western partners who are afraid of the consequences. They never thought that in the 21st century there could be such examples as those they read about in textbooks, in history books, or saw in movies. But they exist, and these examples are coming to life before our eyes. They are now a reality. This is not just something virtual, and of course, it can understandably make them wary. But as John Paul II, the sane and great man, once said, "Do not be afraid." This is now the key principle that should prevail. Do not be afraid of the West. Do not be afraid of Europe. Do not be afraid of Putin and Russia, but act more decisively and actively, because it is necessary to support this revolutionary war and ultimately to overthrow the criminal Putin neo-imperial regime. Only then can we talk about lasting peace in Europe. Everything else is just temporary solutions and concepts, attempts to achieve a ceasefire or a truce. And Putin, of course, is interested in reaching some kind of formulation like Minsk 3, Minsk 4, Minsk 5, Istanbul 2, Istanbul 3, 4, 5, and so on. This is also in his interest to say, well, let's move forward gradually, drag things out. For example, today one delegation met and say on the 15th. Now let's hold the next round of negotiations on the 25th. All the while, without stopping the shelling. After the 25th of May, let's now meet on the 5th or 10th of June, and then on the 15th of June, and then the 20th, and so on and so on. In other words, these are Putin's real intentions right now, to drag out the process, to continue fighting in the hope that our resistance and our strength will be exhausted and that he will eventually be able to force Ukraine to capitulate, all the while hoping that the West will help him achieve this. That is why the position of our Western partners is so important right now. Well, at the very least, let's see how they respond today. At least there is some optimistic news. And a report from the American agency Bloomberg, which notes that if Russia does not cease fire today, expect a strong response from Europe and the United States. Well, we'll see. I would like it to be exactly that way, because, after all, as I said at the beginning, it's long past time to move from words to decisive actions and deeds, because only the language of force, only the language of pressure works, in various aspects, on the front lines, economically, financially, diplomatically, politically. This is the only thing Putin understands, and only this can really force him to agree to end the war, to stop the fighting. This is the primary intermediate stage, and then we must be prepared for the fact that this war will truly end only when the neo-imperial Moscow regime is completely dismantled. And we have to be ready for this. We really, like those revolutionaries in the good sense of the word, must do this. And we have to inspire the West so that they understand there is indeed simply no other way to end this war. That is why national resistance must continue. Ukraine's defense forces, as before, are focused on inflicting maximum losses on the enemy, destroying their rear positions, eliminating their reserves, and, among other things, resuming deep strikes on Russian territory and targeting facilities of the Russian military-industrial complex, as well as other military sites within Russia, thereby reducing their capacity to produce weapons and, as a result, diminishing the offensive potential of their army. And this will continue to be their focus moving forward. And we are focused on continuing our struggle. We are not letting our guard down. The national resistance continues. The war is not over. And it is unlikely to end this week. Nor, obviously, should we expect a ceasefire. at least if there are only statements, honor promises, if there are only proposals but no real actions that will force Putin, he will not be afraid. Moreover, the lack of response from the West only encourages the aggressor to act more actively, in order to demonstrate the weakness of the West and, so to speak, to divide and split both NATO and the European Union, to undermine this unity and show the whole world the unviability of the Western project. And only Ukraine can revive the viability of this Western project, around which the West must unite. I will be following the events of this week and, of course, keeping you informed. And don't forget, friends, that despite everything, with confidence and God's help, we are moving only forward. Take care of yourselves, and glory to Ukraine.